wanted to continue slavery. The Mexicans had totally abolished slavery in 1836. That's the year Texas tore itself from Mexico. And it didn't tear itself away to become a state of the United States. They wanted to set up their own republic. Why did they want to set up their own republic? So that they could continue the slave trade. Because they wanted to compete with the United States on the slave trade. Everybody wanted a piece of that moneymaker. Slavery was the American moneymaker. The wealth from slavery is the foundation on which this country was built. You can't understand America unless you understand the genocide against the Native Americans and the enslavement of the Africans. Texas was a republic from 1836 to 1845. Texas had its own slave ships going to Cuba, going to Brazil, and going to Africa. You could see ships with the Texas flag on them in Africa. But going back to what Brother Henry said earlier about steps forward and steps back, Frederick Douglass gives this speech in 1852. 1857 was the Dred Scott decision, where Justice Taney, who was the Chief Justice, who, by the way, Bonita also owned slaves. You can't get away from it. Also owned slaves, said in a ruling, black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. Now that, together with the Compromise of 1850, made it look like we would never get free. I mean, think about this. Congress passes a law in 1850 that legally compels every citizen to return runaway slaves. And then right behind that comes a decision that says we don't have, never will have any rights in this white man's land. How dire a situation could it have been? But just think, 2 years later, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. 2 years after that, 1859, the Civil War begins. So whenever we think of how dire the situation, how dire must it have been to Frederick Douglass? How dire must it have been to him? I mean, we don't face a quarter yet, anyway, of the challenges that our people had to face then. He did not give up. Imagine that. And you know what that law of 1850 did? It not only endangered runaway slaves, it endangered free black people. They could snatch a free black person. And there were free black people, y'all. There really were. Wasn't a whole lot, but they were. And there was some in every state and every colony. And you saw that movie 12 Years a Slave. That's right. They snatched that. He was a free man. They hoodwinked him. And it's a true story, by the way.
That's right.
It's a true story. They hoodwinked him, took him not to Georgia, not to Mississippi. They took him to Baltimore. They took him to Baltimore, drugged him, and sold him down the river. Literally. He ended up in Mississippi. So it was a dire situation. But Frederick Douglass, you know, he and all the other people that were in that movement, you know, they kept going. They didn't stop.
So you saying that now, as we fast forward here to the 21st century, we saw under President Obama the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And right now we're seeing, we're still, even though he's not the president anymore, they still consider this, we in the media still refer to this as the Trump era America. We're still in the Trump era because he's still very much influential, as we can see.
Right.
But I want to ask you, Mr. Ham, remember Tavis Smiley and your good friend, Dr. Cornel West, got in a lot of trouble.
That's my brother.
Gotten a lot. I'm not at all asking about his candidacy. I want to backtrack a little bit.
Still my brother.
Right. What I want to get into now.
I will not deny my brother.
But remember, they got into a lot of trouble over their criticism of Barack Obama. Right. And so Tavis Smiley's rationale was, and you speaking about Douglas's influence on Lincoln, that good presidents are not born, they're made. And he always said how Douglas had to be, how Lincoln had to be made to be a good president from Douglas. So what I'm going to ask you is, and I'm not asking you at all to name names there, brother, but right now, the Democrats are coming under, I actually did a video about this, and I explained that it's very sad because you have, people like myself. You remember that time last year, you, Reverend Mark Thompson, and Reverend Conrad Tillett got into it, and you tried to be the voice of reason, I tried to be the voice of reason. They were going at it. So Mark Thompson...
Man, them preachers was cussing like it wasn't no tomorrow. I never seen preachers cuss so much.
We were on air. We were on All Politics Are Local, and I was asked to come on. I'm trying to,
I didn't know preachers could cuss. I didn't until that show.
Right, we're looking at them, and so, we, myself and Mr. Ham, we were trying to be the voice of reason. So, they got into it. Reverend Mark Thompson had went at Reverend Conrad Tillett because Reverend Conrad said, well, look, if Trump gets in, we're going to have to still kind of work with him, this, that, and the third. What I'm asking you is, okay, I'm noticing that every time, now you just finished running for U.S. Senate, okay? And by the way, he ran on a platform of reparations, but after last week's debate with President Biden and former President Trump, you had several people that went up there trashing people such as Tariq Nasheed, 19 Keys, Boyce Watkins. Those of us who have been seen as being critical of Democrats were always accused of being undercover Trump supporters. If Douglas had been alive today, and I'm asking this as a historian, would he have jumped on the case of Obama or President Biden, or it's definitely Obama? What is your interpretation? How would he deal with a presidency today, especially a Democratic presidency, since the majority of our people do support the Democrats?
Well, I mean, who am I to say what Frederick Douglass would have done or said? I can only speculate. I think that Douglas would have been like most black people and initially supported Obama because he was black. Now, once he became president, I think he'd have put a fire in his behind. Douglas could be, man, look, you thought Imam Baraka could tear you a new one. Frederick Douglass could do just as well. Like I said, Douglas was one of Lincoln's biggest critics up until the Emancipation Proclamation. He really was, because Lincoln wanted to ship us out, and Douglas said, if we gotta leave, you gotta leave too, because we've been here as long as you have. That was Douglas's position. He was not in favor of colonization. It's interesting that you asked that, because
I had to ask just to let you know, because I've actually heard many people say, I'm not sure if you said this, Mr. Ham, but I've actually heard it said many times that Frederick Douglass was like, you know how we say that the voice was the prototype for the public black intellectual? I've heard people say that Douglass was the prototype of the, quote, black leader.
There's probably a lot of truth to that. Frederick Douglass was not God. He was a man. He was a mortal man. And, he had good positions on a lot of issues, and he had some positions on some issues that people didn't agree with. Like, maybe I need to do some more study. I don't know if I should even mention this or not. But Frederick Douglass did not voice support. I don't know that he voiced opposition. He did not voice support for the 40 acres and a mule.
I was getting ready to ask you his position on reparations.
Right.
I was actually getting ready to come to
What
that.
what he was demanding was that black people should have a right to vote.
Sound familiar?
Right. So now I just learned that recently because, you know, to do this program, I had to do some study. You know, I wasn't going to come in here with these knowledgeable people. Because I know somebody in here would be like, you know, he said this. You know, like Dr. Carter over there. I know because she knows. But he didn't oppose the 40 acres and a mule, but he didn't fight for it. He was fighting for the right to vote, which was achieved for black men, not for black women. Also, many people don't know, Frederick Douglass had been nominated for president several times. He declined the nomination. There were all kind of parties back then. There were different political parties. It wasn't Democrats and Republicans like it is now. It was different political parties. There was an equal rights party. There was all kind of parties. There was a free soil party. There was all kind of parties. But Frederick Douglass did get nominated several times for president, and he did get nominated several times for vice president. This is in the 19th century, and he declined the nomination, you know, both times. He did, however, hold a number of government jobs after the Civil War, you know. But going back to Douglass and the Civil War, Frederick Douglass pushed Lincoln to recruit black men into the Union Army, which turned the tide of the Civil War. The North was losing the war because the resolve to fight was not there. Like if you see that movie Gangs of New York, you see anybody seen Gangs of New York? There's a scene in there where the Irish are getting off the boat and they go into this barn and they go in with their regular clothes on, one side of the barn, and they come out with Union uniforms on. They didn't come to America to fight, especially didn't come to America to fight to emancipate slaves. So they got mad and they burned down the black community in New York. It was called the Draft Riots. Black people didn't always live in Harlem. Black people lived at the other end of Manhattan Island where the World Trade Center was. When mandatory conscription was implemented by the Union forces, the white people went crazy. And they tried to burn down, it's called the Draft Riot. So you say riot and you think of black people. Most of the riots was white people's riots. We only got our riots like in the 1960s. But up until that point, most of the major riots, you know, were white racist riots. And they tried to burn the black community down, and black people had to find somewhere to live, so they gradually migrated up to Harlem. Wasn't no black people in Harlem before the draft riot, hardly any before the draft riots. Draft riots drove us up there. But Frederick Douglass, after they convinced Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a military recruitment document, most of y'all probably know that, it didn't free all slaves. It only freed those slaves in the states, parishes, and rebellions that were part of the Confederacy, that were quote unquote in rebellion. And he really didn't have the power to enforce it there because they were behind enemy lines. So to get this freedom, black people had to escape, black men had to escape from the plantation, cross Confederate lines, join the Union Army, and survive, and then you had your freedom. Douglass was in the forefront of the recruitment effort to get black men to come into the Union Army. He sent his 2 sons, who were of age, to join the Union Army. They joined the army and they saw combat. They didn't join the army because they was Frederick Douglass' sons, they got, some office work. No, they saw combat. 220,000 black men answered the call of the Emancipation Proclamation, joining all branches of the military service. 186,000 joined the Army. The others joined the other branches of service. 60,000 black men were killed in the Civil War. 100,000 were wounded. And then, this is the other thing. I'm glad you asked me that question. Because, like now we always going for the last how many ever elections we've had, it's the lesser of two evils. But it's always been the lesser of two evils. There's never been a situation where black people had an optimal choice. Never. We joined the Union Army, which is the engine to defeat the Confederacy, to fight the Confederacy. So black men join the Union Army, they gotta fight the Confederate soldiers, but then they gotta fight in the Union Army. They didn't receive equal wages, they had to fight for equal wages. There were black soldiers who refused to take the wage. Who refused. They would rather not have the wage than have less than what the white soldier, their white counterpart had. They got guns that didn't work. They didn't get boots that they needed. They didn't get full uniforms. But they fought anyway because they were fighting for something greater than the Union, greater than the North. They were fighting for the liberation of black people. And when captured by the Confederacy, most of the time black soldiers were not taken prisoner. They were massacred. They were killed en masse. One of the slogans of the Civil War was "Remember Fort Pillow," because black soldiers had been massacred there. Mass graves had been found. The Confederates had no sympathy whatsoever for black prisoners of war. They would keep the white prisoners of war and most of the time kill the black soldiers. People don't know half the story of the price that was paid for our emancipation, paid for with lives and blood and treasure. And we don't do anything today. We make up holidays. We make stuff up. And I'm not saying it's bad. Some of the stuff we make up is good. But it has no historical connection. Who goes to the black Civil War soldiers' graves and puts flowers there on Memorial Day or Veterans Day? Who does that? Because people prayed for an end to slavery. They petitioned for an end to slavery. They voted for an end to slavery. They wrote letters for an end to slavery. They appealed for an end to slavery. But in the end, it took the force of arms to emancipate us. And we never acknowledged that. It's as if black soldiers didn't even exist. I love Sister Harriet Tubman. We pop members got on buses and went to Harriet Tubman's home in upstate New York. But you would think that Harriet Tubman was the only black person in the Civil War. I'm not saying, because somebody gonna walk and he don't like black women. I am not saying diminish the role of Harriet Tubman. I'm saying acknowledge the black men that gave their lives for the liberation of black people. Every black church, every mosque, every institution should have something. What are we doing when we celebrate Juneteenth and we don't even acknowledge the price that was paid? I like having a good time. You'll see me at No, I get my drink on.